Yet 52 ranch hands couldn't break the wild Mustang. Until a mail-order bride from Russia did this. The Dust Creek Ranch was a frozen hell, a place exuding raw isolation, bitter regret, and a bone-deep weariness. Snow clung to the world like a shroud, silencing everything but the wind's mournful howl. From his porch, Boone watched the black stallion, Shadow, a demon of muscle and fury, its dark coat a slash against the endless white. For months, he'd offered $500 to any man tough enough to break him. All had failed. The horse, like Boone's own heart, refused to be tamed. It was a stubborn pride, a testament to the scar on his cheek and the deeper one she left behind when she walked out, leaving him with nothing but dust and silence. He was a man who didn't break. The crunch of wheels on ice broke the stillness. The stagecoach. It carried the mail-order bride he'd drunkenly sent for months ago. Another problem to be sent packing, but as the door opened, it wasn't the hardened woman he expected. It was a flash of impossible gold against the snow, and a gaze that promised to thaw more than just the winter. The woman who stepped down from the coach moved with a quiet grace that defied the frozen ruts in the ground. A heavy woolen cloak fell to her ankles, and a fine white sable scarf was wrapped around her neck, a startling luxury in this god-forsaken landscape. But it was her hair that seized the air from Boone's lungs. It was the color of summer wheat, of spun gold, a brilliant living fire against the dead white of the snow. It shouldn't have existed here. He'd expected a hard woman weathered by a hard life. He had not expected sunshine in the middle of a blizzard. She stood for a moment, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her eyes a startling clear blue, taking in the stark lines of the ranch house, the skeletal arms of the cottonwood trees, the vast, unforgiving emptiness that was his kingdom. He saw no fear in them, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. Boone pushed himself off the porch rail, his boots crunching on the packed snow. He was a large man, built of hard angles and silence, and he let his size be a statement, a wall. "You're the one from the letter," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low gravel rough from disuse. She met his gaze directly. "I am Anya." Her voice was soft, yet it carried a strange accent, the melodic cadence of a land far from this one. "And you are Mr. Boone." "Just Boone," he corrected, his tone flat. He grabbed her single-worn trunk from the driver. "This all you got? It is all I need." He grunted, turning toward the house without another word, expecting her to follow. The ranch hands who had stopped their work to watch the spectacle stared openly. A woman like this at Dust Creek. It was like seeing an orchid sprout from a frozen cow patty. It just wasn't natural. As he led the way, he passed the main corral. Inside, Shadow paced like a caged storm. The stallion caught sight of them, its head snapping up, nostrils flaring, letting out a furious snort that sent a cloud of steam into the air. It kicked at the fence, the sound of its hoof against the frozen timber, a sharp crack in the silence. "That's a mean-looking piece of horseflesh," Anya said, her voice still calm, her gaze fixed on the animal. Boone stopped, a cruel, humorless smile touching his lips. "He's got a devil in him. $500 says no one can ride him." He said it as a warning, a way to show her the untamable nature of this place, of its master. But Anya didn't recoil. She simply watched the horse, her head tilted. Her gaze shifted from the furious beast to the hard lines of Boone's face, to the angry red scar on his cheek and back again. And in that moment she saw not two separate creatures, but one single, solitary soul, raging against the cold. What did she see in that horse? What did she see in him? The inside of the ranch house was no warmer than the world outside. A fire smoldered in the great stone hearth, but it gave off more smoke than heat. The furniture was sparse, functional, covered in a thin layer of dust. It was a house that had long forgotten a woman's touch, a place of mere existence, not of living. Boone dropped her trunk by the stairs with a heavy thud. Room at the top of the stairs. First door. Grubs at sundown. Don't expect much. He treated it as a transaction, a delivery. He had paid her passage and now she was here. He hadn't thought beyond that. He hadn't wanted to. Anya looked around the cold, empty room. She looked at his broad, retreating back. He was a fortress of a man walled off and defended. He could see the pain in him as clearly as she could see the scar on his face. It was a familiar language to her. The horse, she said, her voice stopping him at the foot of the stairs. What is his name? Boone turned slowly. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Shadow. Why, Anya pulled the white sable scarf a little tighter around her neck. A faint, determined smile touched her lips. In my country, she said softly, we do not fight the shadows. We sing to them until they remember the sun. He stared at her, a strange feeling coiling in his gut. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something he hadn't felt in years. A flicker of something else. He turned away without another word and strode out of the house, slamming the door behind him, leaving her alone in the cold, echoing silence. He needed a drink. He needed the burn of whiskey to chase away the impossible image of golden hair against the snow and the sound of a voice that spoke of singing to the darkness. But as he stood on the porch, the cold biting at his skin, he knew. He knew this was different. This woman wasn't just another problem. She was a reckoning, and the storm she was about to unleash had nothing to do with the winter. The evening meal was a tense, silent affair. The long wooden table in the main hall was filled with the tired, hungry faces of Boone's ranch hands. They were rough men used to the harsh solitude of the work, and the presence of a woman, especially a woman like Anya, at their table was a disruption they didn't know how to navigate. They ate with their heads down, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the occasional nervous cough. Boone sat at the head of the table, a silent, brooding mountain. He watched Anya from under his brows. She ate with a quiet delicacy that seemed utterly out of place, yet she wasn't intimidated. She met the few curious glances with a small, polite nod, her composure unshakable. She ate the tough steak and the bland beans without complaint, as if she were dining in a fine parlor instead of a dusty, cold ranch house. He found himself annoyed by her calm. He wanted her to be rattled, to see the reality of this place and regret her decision to come. But she gave him nothing. After the meal, as the men shuffled out into the biting cold, Boone poured himself a whiskey. He expected her to retreat to her room, to the relative privacy of her own four walls. Instead, she wrapped her cloak around herself and slipped out the front door. Curiosity, a feeling he despised, gnawed at him. He followed. He found her by the corral, a slim silhouette against the vast, star-dusted canvas of the winter night. The moon was a sliver of ice in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal glow on the snow-covered ground. She wasn't looking at the house. She was watching Shadow. The great black horse was no longer pacing. He stood still in the center of the corral, watching her back, his breath pluming in the darkness. There was a strange stillness between them, a silent conversation Boone could not hear. He leaned against the fence post some yards away, the cold of the wood seeping through his coat. "You'll catch your death out here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Anya didn't turn. "The cold does not bother me. I grew up in it. In Siberia, the winters are long and the silences are deep. You learn to listen to what is underneath. There's nothing underneath here but frozen dirt and disappointment," he grumbled, taking a swig of his whiskey. "No," she said finally, turning to face him. The moonlight caught in her golden hair, framing her face in silver. "There is fear and loneliness. He feels it too." She nodded toward the stallion. "He is angry because he is afraid. Like you." The words hit him like a fist to the gut. No one had ever spoken to him with such raw, unvarnished honesty. He felt a surge of defensive anger. You don't know a damn thing about me, or that horse. I know that you both build walls to keep the world out, she replied, her voice losing none of its softness yet gaining a steel edge. You, with your silence, and him with his teeth. But the walls that keep out the pain also keep out the warmth. She held his gaze for a long moment, her blue eyes seeming to see right through the fortress he had built. He felt exposed to feeling he hadn't experienced since her. He broke the gaze first, turning to stare at the dark outline of the mountains. "Go to bed, Anya," he said, his voice low and tight. "This ain't Siberia. The shadows here, they bite back." She gave a small, sad smile. "Good night, Boone." He watched her walk back to the house, her form swallowed by the darkness. He stayed out in the cold for a long time, the whiskey doing nothing to warm the sudden chill that had taken root deep inside him. The next morning the challenge was made. It wasn't loud or dramatic. After the morning meal, as the men were preparing for the day's work, Anya approached Boone. She stood before him, her hands clasped, her expression serious. "I will take your challenge," she announced, her voice clear and steady enough for all the men in the room to hear. "I will gentle your horse." A stunned silence fell. Then one of the younger hands let out a choked laugh, quickly stifling it when he saw Boone's face. Boone stared at her disbelief, warring with a strange, unwilling flicker of admiration. He thought of her words from the night before. "This is madness. She'll be killed." "That's a fool's game," he said, his voice a low warning. "He's not some pony you can sweet-talk. He's crippled 2 men already. You tried to break him with force." Anya countered, her chin held high. "I will not. I do not ask for the $500. I ask only for your permission, and for everyone to stay back, to give us—" Silence. Her audacity was breathtaking. He should have said no. He should have dragged her away from the corral and locked her in her room for her own safety. It was the sensible thing to do, the right thing to do. But as he looked into her determined blue eyes, he saw not a fool, but a woman with a faith so absolute it was terrifying. And a dark, treacherous part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to see it. He wanted to see if her light could actually touch the darkness he knew so well. He gave a sharp, bitter nod. "Fine. The funeral's your own." He turned and stalked away, the eyes of every man on him. He had just condemned her. Or had he, as he watched her walk toward the corral, not with a rope or a whip, but with nothing but the quiet strength in her soul, he felt a terrifying thought surface. What if she was the only one who could? The pale winter sun offered no warmth. It hung in the vast, bleached sky like a silver coin, casting long, sharp shadows across the snow. The air was so cold it felt brittle, and every sound, the creak of leather, the nervous shuffle of boots, was amplified in the profound stillness. Boone stood with his arms crossed his shoulders, a wall of tense muscle, watching as Anya approached the corral. His men lined the fence, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern. "She's got more sand than sense," one of them muttered. Boone didn't reply. He just watched. His gut was a knot of ice. He had given his word, and a part of him, the cruel, broken part, wanted to see her fail. It would prove him right. It would prove that the world was as hard and unforgiving as he believed it to be. But another part, a part he refused to name, was screaming at him to stop this, to pull her back from the brink. Anya unlatched the heavy wooden gate and slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. She wore no heavy cloak now, only a simple wool dress, her form slender against the vastness of the snowy enclosure. Her golden hair was a beacon in the stark landscape. She carried nothing. No rope, no whip, no weapon. Shadow stood in the far corner, a coiled spring of black fury. He watched her enter, his ears pinned back, a low menacing rumble building in his chest. He pawed at the snow, uncovering the frozen earth beneath a clear display of aggression. Any other man would have been reaching for his iron. Anya did not move toward him. She simply stood by the gate, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She stood there for a full 5 minutes, a statue of impossible calm. She just breathed. Her breath plumed, a steady rhythmic white cloud in the frigid air. Boone found himself holding his own breath. What in God's name was she doing? Then she began to sing. It was not a song he had ever heard. It was a low melodic hum, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was a lullaby sung in her strange foreign tongue, a melody of ancient forests and deep, cold rivers. The notes drifted across the corral, not loud but clear, weaving themselves into the biting wind. Shadow's rumbling stopped. His head came up his ears, twitching, swiveling toward the source of the sound. He took a hesitant step, then another, his initial fury replaced by a profound confusion. He had only ever known shouts, curses, the snap of a whip. This was something else entirely. Anya remained still, her song a constant gentle current. She did not look directly at the horse, but kept her gaze soft, her posture relaxed and non-threatening. Boone watched, mesmerized. He had seen men try to break this horse with sweat, muscle, and blood. He had watched them fail. Now he was watching a slip of a woman with golden hair hold a monster captive with nothing but a song. A crack appeared in the wall around his heart. A dangerous, terrifying crack. Slowly, cautiously, Shadow began to walk toward her. He moved with a wary grace, his powerful muscles tense, ready to bolt or strike at the slightest provocation. He stopped a few feet from her, his great head lowered, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The song softened, becoming a near whisper. Anya slowly, so slowly, unclasped her hands and extended one palm open and down, a gesture of peace. "Easy now, moi malenki voan," she murmured. "My little warrior." Boone's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment, the breaking point. He tensed his body, ready to vault the fence at the first sign of trouble. Shadow stretched his neck forward, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed her outstretched fingers. He trembled, a fine shudder running through his powerful frame. For an eternity that lasted only a few seconds, he remained frozen. Then, with a soft, sighing snort, he nudged his velvet nose into the center of her palm. A collective gasp went through the men watching at the fence. Boone felt the knot in his gut loosen, replaced by a feeling so foreign he couldn't name it. It felt like hope. It was in that precise, fragile moment of connection that the world chose to intervene. A heavy blanket of snow, loosened by the weak morning sun, slid from the steep roof of the nearby barn. It fell with a sudden deafening whoosh, landing on the ground in a deep, explosive spray of white. The sound shattered the spell. Shadow, his trust betrayed by the sudden violence of the noise, screamed. It was a sound of pure terror and rage. He reared up, his powerful forelegs flailing at the sky, his eyes rolling back to show the whites. He was a black demon, unleashed a ton of panic and fury, his hooves now deadly weapons. And Anya was standing directly beneath him. Time shattered. For Boone, the world slowed to a thick, syrupy crawl. He saw the terror flash in Anya's eyes, a fleeting human response before her expression hardened back into resolve. He saw the iron-shod hooves, big as dinner plates, hanging in the air directly above her golden head. He saw his men shouting, stumbling back from the fence in fear. And the fortress inside him didn't just crack, it exploded. He didn't think. He reacted. A primal roar tore from his own throat, a sound of pure, protective fury. Before his mind could register the decision, his body was already in motion. He vaulted the top rail of the fence, landing in the deep snow with a jarring thud, his long legs churning, eating up the distance between them. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a cynic. He was a shield. Anya, he reached her just as Shadow's hooves began their deadly descent. He didn't try to push her out of the way. There was no time. Instead, he threw his body in front of hers, his back to the horse, wrapping his powerful arms around her and pulling her tight against his chest. He braced for the impact, for the shattering of bone, for the blinding pain. He smelled the scent of her hair, something clean and wild like pine needles and winter air, and thought, "This is it." The blow never came. Shadow, in his panicked descent, saw the sudden massive shape of Boone appear, heard his roar. The horse twisted in midair with an impossible agility, his hooves crashing down into the snow, just inches from Boone's back, sending a stinging spray of ice and frozen dirt across them. The stallion landed snorting, eyes wild, and immediately began to buck and spin a whirlwind of black panic in the white corral. Boone held on to Anya, his heart a wild drum against her back. He could feel her trembling, or maybe it was his own body shaking with the violent rush of adrenaline. He didn't let go. He kept his body as a barrier between her and the raging horse. "It's all right." He heard himself growl, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I've got you." He felt her take a single, shuddering breath, and then she seemed to draw strength from his presence. She twisted in his arms, not to escape, but to face the horse with him. Her small hands came up to rest on his forearms, her touch a steadying pressure. "Don't fight him," she said, her voice urgent but clear, her breath warm against his frozen cheek. "He's just afraid. Stand with me. Just stand." It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every instinct screamed at him to grab a rope, to assert dominance, to meet violence with violence. But he looked down into her fierce, trusting blue eyes, and he held his ground. They stood together, a strange, defiant island in a sea of chaos, as the massive horse spun around them. Anya took a deep, centering breath, and she began to sing again. Her voice was different this time. It wasn't a gentle lullaby. It was stronger, more powerful, a resonant chant that cut through the horse's panicked screams. It was a song of command, a song of reassurance, a song that said, "I am here. I am not afraid. There is no danger." Boone felt the vibrations of it through her body into his own. He watched, astounded, as Shadow's frantic bucking began to slow. The wild spinning subsided into nervous, dancing steps. The horse's ears, which had been pinned back in fury, began to flicker, listening. His wild eyes were still wide, but the sheer terror was being replaced by an exhausted confusion. He finally came to a stop a dozen feet away, his sides heaving, his black coat slick with sweat despite the freezing air. He stood, head-low breath coming in great steaming gasps, his gaze fixed on the two figures standing together in the snow. The immediate danger had passed. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of two humans and one horse. Boone slowly, reluctantly loosened his grip on Anya. The warmth of her body left him, and the biting cold of the world rushed back in. He looked at her, at the dusting of snow in her golden hair, at the fierce, unyielding spirit in her eyes. He had moved to protect her from the horse, to shield her from the untamed wildness of his world. But as he stood there, his heart still pounding in his chest, he realized the truth. The true danger in that corral wasn't the stallion. It was her. It had always been her. The world held its breath. The men at the fence were statues carved from ice. Even the wind seemed to have died waiting. In the center of the corral, three beings stood in a fragile, unspoken truce: Boone, Anya, and the exhausted stallion. Boone took a half-step back, putting a little space between them, though his arm still brushed against hers. He felt a profound reluctance to break the contact completely. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the quiet strength that radiated from her small frame. He had faced down gunslingers, survived stampedes, and weathered blizzards that would kill a lesser man, but he had never felt as fundamentally altered as he did in this moment. Anya gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Her gaze, however, was on Shadow. The horse stood head bowed, sides still heaving. The fight was gone, leaving behind only a deep, trembling weariness. The wildness had been burned out of him not by force, but by a terror so profound it had reset his very soul. "He is ready now," she whispered, her voice for Boone's ears alone. She began to walk toward the horse, her movements slow, deliberate, and fluid as water. She didn't sing. The time for singing was over. This was about something else now. This was about acceptance. Boone watched his own muscles coiled tight. He didn't trust the horse. He didn't trust the silence. But he trusted her. The realization was a shock, a jolt as powerful as the whiskey he favored. He trusted this woman he had known for barely a day more than he had trusted anyone in years. Anya reached Shadow and laid a hand on his sweat-slicked neck. The horse flinched, a tremor running through his skin, but he did not pull away. She stroked him, her touch firm but gentle, murmuring to him in her low, melodic tongue. Words of comfort, of praise, of shared understanding. She ran her hand along his powerful back over the place where a saddle had never been welcome. She gathered the horse's long black mane in one hand. Then, with a smooth, athletic grace that stunned Boone, she swung herself up onto Shadow's bare back. There was no saddle, no bridle, only a woman and a horse bound by a new and fragile trust. For a moment they were a perfect, breathtaking statue. The woman with hair of gold sitting astride the black stallion against a canvas of pure white snow. It was a sight of impossible beauty, a myth made real. Then, with a gentle nudge of her heels, Anya urged him forward. Shadow walked. He didn't buck. He didn't fight. He walked his steps calm and measured as if he had been ridden this way his entire life. Anya guided him with the slightest shifts in her weight, her hands resting lightly on her neck. They circled the corral once, then twice. It was a slow, majestic parade of surrender. A victory not of force, but of spirit. The men at the fence let out a collective, ragged cheer. They threw their hats in the air, their gruff faces broken by wide, incredulous smiles. They were cheering for her for the impossible thing she had just accomplished. Boone didn't cheer. He couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe. It was wonder. And it was a deep, aching pang of something that felt dangerously like joy. He watched her, this impossible woman, her golden hair catching the pale winter sun as she rode the darkness he had thought untamable. She rode Shadow over to the fence where he stood. The great horse stopped docile as a lamb and lowered his head. Anya smiled down at Boone, her blue eyes sparkling with a light that outshone the sun. "It is done," she said simply. He looked up at her, and the words he wanted to say caught in his throat. "You are a miracle. You are magic." But those weren't his words. He was a man of dirt and iron, not poetry. He reached up his calloused, work-roughened hand, resting on her knee. His touch was hesitant, almost clumsy, but it was the most honest thing he had ever done. Her knee was warm through the wool of her dress. "Anya," he managed to say, his voice a raw rasp. He didn't know what he was going to say next, but as he looked up at her, he saw a small trickle of blood running from a scrape on her hand, where she must have hit the fence when the horse first reared. Without thinking, he released her knee and gently took her hand in his. He raised it, his gaze locked on the small, insignificant wound. And he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he would kill any man, fight any beast, to ensure she was never harmed again. But what would he do to protect her from himself? The cheers of the men faded into a muted background hum. The world for Boone had narrowed to the small scraped hand he held in his own. The sight of her blood, a thin crimson line against her pale skin, ignited a fire in him that was fiercely protective and terrifyingly new. This small wound felt more significant than any he had ever suffered. "You're hurt," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. Anya looked down at her hand as if noticing it for the first time, then back at him, a small, reassuring smile on her lips. "It is nothing. A scratch." "No," he said, his grip on her hand firm but gentle. "It's not." He turned to still holding her hand and began walking toward the house, leading the horse and its rider with him. The men parted for them, their expressions of rowdy celebration shifting to a quiet, respectful curiosity. They saw the look on the boss's face, a look they had never seen before, and they knew this was no longer about a horse. Anya slid gracefully from Shadow's back as they reached the porch. The stallion, instead of bolting, simply stood his gaze, following her, a silent, four-legged guardian. Boone led her inside into the cold, dusty main hall. He kicked the door shut behind them, plunging them into the dim light and the quiet of the house. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was charged, filled with everything that had just happened, and everything that was about to. He led her to the fire, which had burned down to glowing embers. "Sit," he commanded, his voice softer now. He pushed a heavy wooden chair closer to the hearth. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a small basin of water and a clean rag. He knelt before her, a man his size kneeling. The gesture felt monumental, a shifting of the very foundations of his world. He took her hand again, his large calloused fingers impossibly gentle, as he dipped the rag in the water and began to clean the small scrape. He worked in silence, his head bowed, his focus entirely on the task. He was a man who built fences, broke horses, and fought the land into submission. He did not perform acts of tenderness. Yet here he was, kneeling in the dust of his own cold house, tending to a wound no bigger than a thumbnail. The silence stretched thick and heavy. He could feel her watching him. Why, she finally whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air. "Why did you do that? For me?" He stopped his work but didn't look up. He stared at the small wound, at the delicate bones of her hand resting in his massive one. I wouldn't let him hurt you." The admission was torn from him, raw and ragged. "You were afraid," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, profound truth. He finally raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the jagged line of the scar on his cheek. Yeah, he breathed the word, a confession. I was. He had never admitted fear to another living soul. Not of the horse, of losing you. The walls were gone. The fortress had crumbled. He was just a man kneeling before a woman, his heart laid bare. Anya's expression softened, her blue eyes filled with a deep, compassionate understanding. She reached out with her other hand, her fingers tracing the line of the scar on his cheek. Her touch was feather-light, a ghost of a caress, but it sent a tremor through his entire body. "We all have our scars, Boone," she said softly. "Some on the outside, some on the inside. They show us where we have been. They do not have to decide where we are going." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The ice that had encased his heart for years finally completely melted away, leaving a raw, aching vulnerability in its place. He was no longer the master of Dust Creek. He was no longer the hard man with the broken heart. He was just hers. He finished cleaning her hand, then, still kneeling, he simply held it, reluctant to let go. The $500 prize was forgotten. The bet was forgotten. The only thing that mattered was the warmth of her skin against his. "Anya," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Stay. Don't just be a mail-order bride. Be the heart of this place. Be my heart." She didn't answer with words. She slid from the chair, kneeling in front of him on the dusty floor. She took his face in her hands, her thumbs gently stroking his weathered cheeks. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss of quiet promises of shared solitude, of two broken pieces finally finding their fit. It was the end of the winter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a silent, peaceful white. But inside the cold ranch house, by a dying fire, two lonely souls had finally found their warmth.